from the Camp Pendleton Historical Society, and you are talking about the Magee family and Las Flores Rancho.
That's
Thank
correct.
you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Sounds good to everyone back here? All right, so I'm back again. So either you guys are gluttons for punishment and are really that bored and need to just get out to hear someone, or I'm not sure what it is, but I'm glad you guys have me back. I really did. QVC. I just got them at QVC. My new shoes. Sorry. 3 easy payments. Sorry. Okay. I know. I saw the girls looking. I love them. All right. So last time I was here and we talked about Camp Pendleton and how it all came together. So this time we're going to talk a little bit about another portion. So if you were here last time, you heard me talk about the tract of land that we have here. And I'm going to skip this over. I think I'm going to be in your way no matter what. I'm so sorry. Okay. So we talked about how it made up the multiple tracts that really did come together. So it was the land, of course, known as the ranchos out there, the Marines, and how they came together to actually make Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. Alrighty? We talked about that, but there is one other little place, and that is the Las Flores Adobe, and it also has the Magee family that live there, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with that name, right? So you're going to hear a lot of familiar names here tonight when I talk. We divided it up into really 4 diverse kind of areas. Of course, the first one was the Native Americans or the Indians, and we talk quite heavily about them in this presentation. And also the mission era. Of course, this is a picture of the mission that's down in Oceanside. That's the mission San Luis Rey. And of course, then we also talk about the Rancho era, one of my favorite eras to discover. And then we will also talk about the Marines during this time. So that was the 4 tracks we really focused on. And I'm going to introduce you to this 5th track that is such a small portion, but such a large part of Camp Pendleton. So here we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm just going to introduce you to these people and not go into too much detail because we did that last time. I just want to make sure you remember that the first families here on Camp Pendleton were the Pico brothers, Andre Pico, Pio Pico, right? And the Foresters, Don Juan Forester married Pio Pico's and Andres Pico's sister Isadora, right? And then, of course, we had Mr. Flood. He is the Comstock Load winner. That's how you want to say it. One of the richest men in California at that time. And then, of course, we have the O'Neill family. Those were the 4 families that lived in that ranch house that you're going to come and see on the 18th. I will be one of your tour guides there as well. So there was also the Magee family. So up here, we're going to be focusing on Victoria Magee, her husband Henry Magee, and we're going to be focusing on their oldest daughter, Jane. Alrighty? Now, of course, we all know at this time in 1769 that Gaspar de Portola came through that area, named the river Santa Margarita River after the St. Margaret. And we also know that there was the first baptism, Christian baptism up there, and it's now called Cristianitos, which is up towards San Clemente. Alrighty? And at this time as well, there in Alta California, there was another little area that I'm not even sure if anyone has ever even seen it, or you drive by it all the time on the 5 freeway. It's amazing. There's an exit that says Las Pulgas, which means the fleas, right, in Spanish, or loosely translated. There was an area right there off the 5 freeway that belonged to the Lucenio Indians. And we'll talk some more about that. But the Indians called it Uxmal, which means loosely like little flower, little rose, something like that. When the Spanish came through there, they named it Las Flores, after the Las Pulgas incident. So if you can catch just a glimpse of it when you're doing the speed limit on the 5 freeway right there, flying by it. If you look off to your right, if you're going north, you can see the water tower. We have a windmill there and whatnot. But if you don't know what you're looking for, you're really not going to see it because there's so much scrub and whatnot there. And there's also the train track. But I've kind of outlined it for you so you can see how close it is to the 5 freeway and how close it is to that Las Flores exit right there as well. And it is completely on Camp Pendleton still. Now, during all of this time, too, we have, remember the mission, San Luis Rey. So that mission has that huge umbrella that we called it the last time as well. One of the largest with over 950,000 acres that's going on and that they are in charge of, right? So the Franciscan monks that are there have to find some way to keep an eye on what's going on their land during this whole time. And it was Father Pyrie that really came up with this really good idea on kind of for all of these lands to kind of help keep control and kind of know what's going on at the same time. Now, of course, we all know that missionary work really was to convert the Indians. And once we did that, then they would be taught, well, simultaneously or before, they would train them on how to do all of these things that we needed or that they needed them to do. Help them build a mission, so they taught them how to make adobe. They would teach them how to clean houses, how to take care of things that they were not used to at all before. And so they would want the Indians to come to them. And that's what they did. They brought them into the mission lands and trained them and took care of them. But this San Luis Rey mission is so large, it's hard to get everyone to come in. So Father Perry thought of, well, why don't we take our missionary work to them? So one of the things that they did was they built what was called an estancia. Familiar with that name, right? An estancia is a building that the Franciscan monks would visit, where an asistencia is a building where they actually lived in. So this was an estancia that we have there on Las Flores, okay? Now, this is a drawing, of course, from that time. The left-hand side was the actual chapel, and it had the steeple, and it had 2 bells in it with a big, beautiful cross on the top. The center portion was really for, kind of like, I don't want to say a hotel, but you could stay there. And that's also where the priests would stay, traveling in between Mission San Luis Rey and Mission San Juan Capistrano. So this was kind of like their place. And what they could do then is they could stay there, and then the Indians could come to them, and they could baptize them. They could do whatever they needed to do while they were there. The other side there to the right was their storage area. They did a lot of bartering and a lot of back and forth things with a lot of the ships that traveled up and along the coast, either American or English ships that came up through there. And many of the ships used that steeple as kind of a point, a fixed data point, so they would know how far they needed to go up and down the coast. So, because it was visible for miles. Because if you think of it, when you're on the F5 freeway, everything is really flat once you're up there. So you'd be able to see this for quite a distance. And at this time, a lot of things are going on, right, between Spain and Mexico and all of that. Alta California belongs to a territory in Mexico. Mexico then belongs to Spain. And Spain has all of these land holdings that they know nothing about. Well, thank goodness the Mexican independence came about in 1821. They got away, right, from Spain. But now they have the problem of what? Now what do we do with all the missions? What do we do with all the Indians that are at these missions? So what they pretty much did, and what they were so afraid of too, is what's going to happen to them? What's going to happen to the Indians now that all of the Franciscan monks leave? We have trained them, but have we trained them enough? Can they live by themselves? We force them to forget their own ways. Are they going to become wild again and run up into the hills? Or, they really didn't know. They were also very afraid, too, that some of these so-called land-grabbing English men would take their land from them. So they were very afraid of all of this as well. So what they actually did in this area was, at this time, oh no, Pio Pico wasn't there yet, but what they did was they gave them 20,000 acres that they then named Uxmal. And they all lived there. There was about 30 families that lived in this area. And they actually called it the Pueblo Libre, which is kind of like a commune, I guess you can say, because not one person owned it. All 30 some Indians really owned it together, right? Are you guys familiar with that area? You've heard of that already? Okay. So things are, going on there. And remember we talked about it being so large, right, that they needed administrators to take care of this. So Governor Alvarado asked his buddy Pio Pico and Andres Pico to be the administrators at this time while this land is there, all right? And said, hey, I need you guys to kind of go over there and keep an eye on what's going on. So Andres Pico, familiar with him, he's the military guy. Pio Pico on the right here, he's the very, what do we say, very kind of a go-get-it kind of guy. Let's just put it that way. Very charismatic. I can't even say that word. But he could charm. He's like a snake charmer. That's the way. Like he could charm you into buying shoes from QVC, like no problem. All day. But so, and he had no problem with going after things that would better him or better his family. So let's just remember that. Okay. So about this time, as the governor appoints Pio Pico, he is now what I refer to as, he's back kind of like a fox in a hen house. Because now he's there, okay, and he's already looking at this land. And he's looking at all the land around him as well, all right? So from what we gather from the Indians in that area, he really wasn't the nicest person to the Indians. He treated them unfairly many times, and he would take things from different areas and lend them to his friends and things of that sort. So the Indians in that area really weren't too happy with the Pico brothers, especially Pio Pico, because Andres wasn't around a whole lot. He was out fighting battles like the Battle of San Pascual. He was there at that as well. So it was mostly Pio Pico. Here comes someone I'm hoping everyone is familiar with. Okay, so this gentleman here, we all know how great he was, born at Guajome, right? And he was then trained by the Franciscan mission to learn to read and write and speak Spanish, which was something not a lot of them did at that time. So he was already a step ahead. Now this is just kind of like my rendition on how I thought he looked. No one has pictures of him, of course. I was talking to Rebecca. No one even has a drawing or really anything of him. So I'm sorry if this is not how he looked, okay? But he was such a pivotal thing, a pivotal guy during this time. He was part of those 30-some-odd Indians there, right, at Las Flores, and he really spoke out against the treatment of those Indians. And he really spoke out about how bad Pio Pico was treating them. He really did. But unfortunately, Pio Pico just kind of, put him aside and didn't really pay much attention to him. I think he threw him in jail a couple times or something, but he still came back because it meant that much to him, to see how their families were treated. Pablo ended up talking to some of the Franciscan monks, wrote to them as well about the treatment, right? And that's when they said, okay, we will take them away as the administrators of that area. Which I'm sure Pablo thought, this is fantastic, because now they're gone. But I hate to tell you, we all know who comes back, all right? So just kind of a quick note to give you an idea what's going on around there. You guys have been driving down the 5 freeway and seeing everything going on, right? Talk about the Marine Corps, you think of battles. So there's always these mock battles going on, storming the beaches and all that stuff. Would you be surprised if I told you that there was actually a battle of Las Flores? There was an actual battle there, all right? So what is happening is we have Carlos Antonio Carrillo, who is now the newly appointed governor intern of California. And we also have Alvarado, that is the governor of California, okay? So on one of these days here in July, I think it was about the 18th or 19th, we all of a sudden have these armed men, well taken care of, ride up from the south and start setting up a perimeter around the estancia. And all the Indians are, well, what are you doing? Who are you people, right? And they said, don't worry, we're here to take care of some business, whatever happens. So they set everything up, and I will admit, later on that night, everyone wrote down about how the guys went down into one of the little canyons there and commenced to celebrating a little too much. You always seem to find a spot in your saddlebags for a bottle of something, right? So they consumed all those bottles of something that night and carried well into the night. They woke up the next morning to see supporters on horseback for Alvarado coming right at them. Alvarado had said in his mind, there isn't any way that I'm going to let Carrillo have this without a good old fight. He's not just going to take this from me. Alrighty? So sure enough, that day, there was actually musket volleys that happened right there on that spot. One of the sides, we're not sure, actually launched one cannon shot. No one will say which side it was. And sure enough, after that, so they surrendered. Someone surrendered, and that was it. That was the Battle of Las Flores. That's the best battle ever, as far as I'm concerned. And the thing was, so they met for 3 days of intense negotiations. I highly doubt it was intense, and they came to the realization that everyone had done the honorable thing. Everyone showed up. Everyone's good. And so what they did was they had Carrillo. They released Carrillo to the custody of his wife, which might have been worse than the battle. I don't know what their relationship was like, right? And they said then that Alvarado would just go ahead and stay where he was, all right? And when you think about it, I'll bet you these guys all knew each other. They were probably family on both sides, like, hey, cousin, hey, what's up? You know, that kind of a thing. So wouldn't it be horrible to shoot your own cousin? Anyway. So after that happened, sure enough, well into the night, they had a fiesta. They actually write down that they actually ate some of the donkeys or mules that they had with them, and they just had a blast out there for a couple of days, right? And then maybe Carrillo went home to his wife. I don't know. But I'll tell you what, there might be some in this room that are very happy that Carrillo survived that battle, because he was actually Leo Carrillo, the actor, the Cisco Kid, Pancho. That was his great-grandfather. So without him, we wouldn't have had the Cisco Kid, and we wouldn't have Pancho and all that wonderful stuff. So you're welcome. So to be honest, now we have this Las Flores Pueblo Libre sitting right there. We have the Santa Margarita Ranch. Okay? And there it is, 89,000 acres. That is a pretty good chunk of land, right? Going on right there. But after the Pico brothers had left, now Alvarado is still the governor. So he then gives this land to Pio Pico and Andres Pico. So now they're back. Look who's back. Okay? Interesting enough that now he's kind of back in the hen house, right? So when he comes back this time, Pio Pico, though, he brings a little more land with him, because he has now acquired those ones that I have listed up there, Horno, San Mateo, San Onofre, all of that he brings down too. So now his holdings are now swelling, okay? He has about 113,000 acres. But he's still looking at that 20 some odd thousand acres like, oh man, it's right there in the middle. It's got to be mine, kind of a thing. Alrighty? So one thing I want you guys to remember too is what those what their concerns were about the Indians, okay? So they kept saying they're not ready to be on their own, they just can't do it. And unfortunately, life at Las Flores did not go well for those Indians, okay? They ended up living pretty much in squalor. There wasn't enough food and whatnot to really sustain them because they didn't go and hunt anymore, because they were taught to forget all of that and learn, the right way, alrighty? So did one of those concerns prove to be correct? It almost seems like it did, right? Was he going to take advantage of the Indians that lived there? Maybe he does. Because, remember, Pablo did not care for Pio Pico. But now all of a sudden, they're forming an alliance. Pio Pico now is friends with Pablo. And he somehow talks him into having the Indians there sign over their ownership to Pablo. So he's the one owner now of that area, okay? And they see it as, oh, he'll be our spokesperson. He's been so active, against Pio Pico. This is the way to go. I mean, it almost sounds like it would make sense, really. And then all of a sudden, overnight, bam, Andres and Pio Pico's name shows up on the deed to that land. We're not sure how that happened, but it is on there, and you can see it. And then all of a sudden, look where the families go. Right? They came right over here to you guys. So, did that come true as well? I mean, it almost sounds like it. But the one thing, too, was it just him? Is he really a villain? I don't know. Was it just a collusion of scoundrels? I'm not sure. But as you all know, Pablo is the only one in that tribe or in that area that had an owned land that was given to him by a governor. So, I mean, shortly after all of that happened, he was then awarded or deeded all of the land here in Temecula that now. So that seemed a little, oh, that's weird. All of a sudden, oh, wow, that's great. Okay. So now guess what? Pio Pico is so excited because now look how much land he owns. He owns all the way from Oceanside up there. He goes all the way out to Fallbrook now because they used to own the Fallbrook's Naval Weapons Station as well. So he goes all the way out to Fallbrook. So he's pretty darn happy, okay? So he got all the property and he got that estancia that's been sitting on the property, okay? We all know about the estancia, how it was built, of course, by Adobe. What happens to Adobe that's not protected? It goes right back into its natural state, correct? This is how the Adobe started to look around 1900. It was already deteriorating at this rate up here from that drawing. It continued, of course, to deteriorate because no one was taking care of it. And I'll also tell you another little trick that happened there as well. That's what's left of it today. So the Marines actually put a covering over it. I know, it's kind of sad, right? But when you look at it, if you were able to get up close and look at it, what's wonderful about the adobe that was used even for the house and this, it's full of seashells. Because, and straw and stuff, but it's beautiful, these crunched up seashells, and it's also all over the walkway. Like people are trying to mimic that look from, 1762 or something. Okay, so that's what's left of it. I know. So Pio Pico, surprisingly enough, due to some poor business decisions on his end, ends up having to sell the ranch. Okay? So he sells the ranch. Believe it or not, to his brother-in-law, right? This is a gentleman from England that's married to Isadora, the sister. So they move into the ranch house that you guys are going to see. I'm so excited. And the thing that he brought with him was all the land he owned in Orange County. They lived in the Mission San Juan Capistrano, right? He bought it for like $350 or something, and they lived there for a while. Anyway, so he brings it all. So now that ranch goes from Oceanside all the way up to Tustin, all the way Mission Viejo, Santa Margarita, all of that. The largest rancho in California by far. So they are living pretty good there, okay? He expands on the ranch house that they had, Pio on them, just had a couple of rooms. Isadora and him have 6 children, so they need to start adding on to this ranch house. And at the same time, about 3 years later, his oldest son, Marcos, gets married. Now, Marcos needs a place to live. So what he did was, they started looking at that land, Las Flores, and thought this would make a great place to build an adobe for you and your family. So that's exactly what they did. That's Marcos' wife and his 2 children, right there. So they went and they built a 2-story adobe. So now at this time, 1867, the estancia is still kind of hanging around. It still had doors, windows, things like that. And we strongly believe that they used a lot of the stuff from that estancia to build this adobe with. I mean, that's just what they did in those days. You know, you couldn't run to Home Depot, obviously, right? So you took door frames, you took window sills, you took those big beams. We don't have any type of lumber on the other side of the mountains there, trust me. So you take whatever you can get. And we strongly believe a lot of it went to that, to the building of that. They lived there until Mr. Forrester's death in 1882. So they lived there for about 20 some odd years. And unfortunately, they had to sell it, all the property as well, due to a very heavy drought that came in the 1860s. Yep, and the 1870s was also the fencing law, right? That hit him hard, the Forrester family. And he was in court more than you can imagine and paying court fees over and over and over. People always trying to sue him over one thing or another to try and get some money. So they sold the land to Richard O'Neill, but the actual financial backer to Richard O'Neill was Mr. Flood, all right? Richard O'Neill is kind of the sweat equity, if that's what you want to say. He's a rancher, so he moves into the ranch house and starts adding on to it even more. And you know, Mr. Flood didn't get to come down and live in the ranch house. I know, oh, sad, right? Poor Mr. Flood. So he kept one of his homes in San Francisco. It's one of his homes. If you guys ever want to know more about the Floods, just look up San Francisco Flood family and you will be surprised at how wealthy this family was. Okay? This is now a private men's club, invitation only, to this day. So don't worry, he fared just fine. So now we're going to talk about Victoria, all right, and how she came into all of this. So Victoria, she was came from a long lineage Spanish family, like so many of them did in those days as well. And shortly after Mr. O'Neill moved into the house, he got to meet Victoria. And we're going to tell you how that meeting came about and what a pivotal moment that was for them. So Pio Pico, when he was the governor, actually deeded her parents the Rancho or Mission El Cajon. And she grew up there for quite some time. And unfortunately for Victoria, though, her mother died, and then a year later her father passed away. things weren't going well either for them at the rancho at that time frame. Things started going, weren't, so many of them were, what is it we call it? Land rich, but money poor. Is that what they say? Yeah. So this was one of the families as well. So she went to go live with her grandmother. So I'll see if anyone recognizes this rancho down in Old Town, San Diego. This is her grandmother and grandfather's house. So this is where Victoria Magee grew up. At this, I'm sorry? No, that's the Esdil mansion. That's right there. Right across from the flagpole. It faces right to that flagpole in the center there. So it looks very green and lush in this photo. So it looks a little different. But this is where Victoria ended up growing up, was here, especially in her latter years. Okay? So she went to go live with them. I suggest go visiting that. It's so nice when you ever get the chance. So at around the age 13, 14, she's getting those stars in her eyes about getting married, right? Like so many girls do. Maybe not today, but back then, they were ready to get married and raise a family and live happily ever after, right? So sure enough, someone comes a-courting, okay? It's an army doctor by the name of Captain Hammond, and he starts to notice Victoria. So sure enough, he comes in and he wants her hand in marriage. So the doctor proposes to her, comes and talks to the grandparents, and the grandparents are like, no. Not only are you a white guy, but you're a Yankee, and you're in the army. You can leave at any time. This is not a good life for our granddaughter. Well, after much debating and talking and all of that, somehow they finally agreed, okay, fine, you can go ahead and get married, but we're not setting a date yet. We want to see what turns out, like what you kind of turn into, okay? So no date is set. Well, poor Victoria's heart was just broken, I'm sure. So guess what they did? So Captain Hammond took her to a friend of his that was a judge, and they got married in his house. And everything was legal, everything was great. I don't want you to think poorly of Captain Hammond at all right? He might have been an opportunist because he was ultimately after that Rancho El Cajon, okay? But he's not a lecher whatsoever. He had plenty of plans to go along with this. His plan was to marry Victoria at this young age. That's fine. He's going to send her away to a Catholic boarding school up north, all right? Then, while he's doing his stuff and being busy, getting his hands on El Cajon, okay, she can come back, and then he wanted to send her to the University of South Carolina, because that's his alma mater. Then she comes back, she'll probably be about 18, 19, then they will be man and wife. This is what his goals were. And then he would then be in charge of the El Cajon, the rancho, all right? Oh, it just sounds great, doesn't it? It just sounds like the way to do it. Well, of course, we live in a little town there. Everyone knows everyone. Grandma knows everything that goes on in that town. So she found out about the secret marriage, okay? She didn't tell Victoria or Captain Hammond that she knew about this marriage, all right? And she had also had a plan. I think Captain Hammond kind of met his match in Senora. All right, ready? So her plan now, so her plan is to talk to Victoria, which she did, and she talked her into going on a little carriage ride with her down to visit family in Tijuana, Mexico. Come with me, please. It'll be so nice to get you out of the house and all of that. So she finally persuades her to go with her. And her plan was to have some banditos waylay the carriage and take Victoria to an undisclosed location. The grandma did not want to know where they were taking her because she knew someone was going to ask her where they take her. So honestly, she can say, I don't know, right? So sure enough, that happens, and Captain Hammond finds out, and of course he's very upset. So he goes to the sheriff forms a posse, they go thundering down there looking for these banditos and the carriage and for Victoria, and they can't find anything. And sure enough, he comes back up and he says, hey, he says, I'm taking all of you to court. I want everyone in court. I want you to swear with your hand on that Bible that what you know about where my Victoria is. I have got to find my Victoria. This is not my 7-year plan or whatever it was he had going on there, right? Well, when they all went into court, they kind of had that, what I call the Schultzy answer. Does anyone remember this guy from Hogan's Hero? I hear nothing. I see nothing. I know nothing. No one knew anything about where she was. So surprisingly enough, Captain Hammond was then transferred. Right, just boom, gone. So the marriage was annulled. And what? Lo and behold, Victoria just, oh, well, she's back. Hey, where have you been? Oh, so here she is. She all of a sudden reappears. Then later on that year, she's still set on being married because that's just what you did at that time. So she actually married Henry Magee, and that's who this is right here. Now we all know that Henry came from New York, right, upstate New York, came down here to fight the Mexican War, like so many of them did at that time. After that, he mustered out and became a cowboy. He drove herds from Mexico up to Arizona and did that hard, unbelievable life that I can't even imagine. What's even else a catcher, I love all these little catches, is he actually rented a room in Victoria, her grandmother, Senor Estudillo, in her house. That's where he saw Victoria. And unknowingly, or maybe knowingly to him, he provided all the horses for the carriage ride that night to get Victoria out of town. Right? So anyway, I don't know if he knew what it was really for, but I like to kind of think he's like, yeah, take my horses, get her out of here, because then maybe I'll have a chance one day, right? So they were married. Jane Magee, like I showed you guys, was the firstborn of 8 children, so she was the oldest, all right? That same stuff was happening with the drought and all of that, 1860s. No joke, this whole area, as we know, was just horrible. So their El Cajon ranch was not doing well, so they had to let go of it. So they got together their meager belongings and went and moved up to that Condor's Nest that's up there by Mount Palomar, right up that way. And that's where they stayed for quite some time. They listed as, what is it called, a meager ranch. It's still a pretty good sized one. And she also then became a teacher down here too from time to time to kind of offset money so that they had all of that. So this was the Victoria that went to visit Mr. O'Neill when he moved into his ranch house. So now I've kind of pulled you all into that. The reason why she had gone to Richard O'Neill's house was not a social visit whatsoever. She had heard some of the vaqueros that used to belong to Mr. Forrester talking about coming and getting Richard O'Neill now that was in the house. They wanted to burn the house down. They were going to steal all the livestock and kill whatever family was in there because they were just that mad. So Victoria had heard that, and she went and warned Richard O'Neill. And he was just ever grateful for that, for her having to do that. So now comes even a more sad part in Victoria's life, which I think was rather short and a little sad to me. Other than the sparks of wonderful of 8 children, Henry really does become kind of a drunkard, and he is not providing for the family. I mean, that's really what happened, okay? And unfortunately, as we know, Victoria, she passes away right after having surgery, cancer surgery, up in San Francisco. She passed away a few hours after the surgery. So now Jane, who's 24, now becomes the matriarch of the family. So she's now going to take care of all her brothers and her sisters. Wow. All right. So Richard O'Neill hears about all of these problems that she's having. Here's how it's not going well for them. Just think of what can I do for poor Jane. She's got a lot on her, you know. Yeah. So he offers her the use of the Las Flores Adobe and gives her a couple thousand acres around the adobe because of what her mother had done for him that one time. So you bet, this is Jane right here with a couple of her siblings. She said, oh yes, I am so taking that. Thank you very much. So what she did was she took the youngest, those are the 4 youngest of the siblings at the time, and one of the little boys over there, that's Lewis, who was the youngest one. She took the 4 youngest, 3 of them, the other ones that were school age, she shipped out to family members so that they could go to school, okay? And she took a bunch of stuff from Condor's Nest, farming implements, things like that, some livestock and whatnot, and now they're going to go make a life at Las Flores. And she was ever so thankful. So they tried their hand at different things to grow, whatnot too. One thing I do want to mention is we have never been able to find any type of written documentation that's saying that the Magees rented this place from the O'Neill family. But like we know, so many transactions in those days were sealed with what? A handshake. So much of it wasn't written down. Gosh darn it, right? Because we want to read about it now, don't we? So it really was, it was theirs, but nothing ever written down about it, right? They even came and they tried to be a dairy farmers there, but of course it was a little too dry for the cows there, so their milk didn't come as much as they would like. They tried to sell it in Oceanside as well. Didn't work so well for them. They tried to grow so many different crops, but the one crop that took off like crazy was lima beans, because they don't need a lot of water. They get the moisture from the ocean right there. She actually had over 3,000 acres of lima beans, literally almost like up to her front door, right. She squeezed as many as she could in there. She was so smart, Jane Magee. She really was. She had the railroad that ran right behind the adobe. She could just load them right up into there. And still to this day, every once in a while, we're so lucky to find a burlap sack that says Magee lima beans on it. And they were very popular in San Diego County and Orange County, of course. So if you ever see one of those, get your claws on those real quick. Love this picture. We still have this harvester at the Las Flores Adobe. There's like 24, 28 horses would pull these harvesters to go out and do the lima beans. So I had to cut my grass yesterday. Like, I never complain when I think of this right here, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
That was a lot of work, holding all of those horses. And I know many of the kids talked about sitting up there with that guy and being able to look down at all the horses, and what a crazy ride that must have been for them. So Jane became known as the Lima Bean Queen. She provided, I'd say almost a quarter of the lima beans for America at the time as well, because there was such a shortage of it, and it could be shipped via that railroad. I mean, it was such a smart thing to do. Jane, of course, as we know, never did marry, but she had 7 brothers and sisters that did marry, and they had a lot of kids, as you can imagine, right? These are just some photos that I found that we have. The kids always came back to Auntie Jane, or to Jenny, is what they called her, to Auntie Jenny. They always came back. They loved it there. So even their children would come back. They loved it when they would come to the ranch. Every child, when they came, they had their own horse. They were assigned tasks and duties and chores according to their gender and their age. They didn't stay there for free, of course. They all got their weekly baths, right, on Saturdays. They all got the fleas picked off of them on Saturdays. And they pretty much all slept together in one big bed, or slept with Aunt Jane up top, and they just loved it. They would go to the beach. They would walk down to the beach and for hours, just spend hours down there. None of them could swim, but they all played in the waves, and they would write down. Another person that is related to Jane on the mother's side, it's his aunt, is Clifford May. Does anyone happen to know who he is? Cliff May? He is the one that designed and is instrumental in putting out what's called that California ranch-style home. Because he grew up at this rancho, he loved that big, wide open and how everything is outside and you bring the outside inside and it's that sprawling kind of a feeling to it. So he grew up there and that's why he became known and started all of these California ranch-style homes. So, did anyone know that? Because you guys are too smart in here for me. So, it's always kind of nice. I love to think of Las Flores as kind of the rural Camelot. Everything was wonderful out there. The children loved it. The family kept it going. And this is where they all loved to be. All right? But as we all know, in 1942, the Marines came on base. So now she's very worried about what do I do? The family's very worried too. She's now 80 years old, and her health is waning. And they're worried though because they have no written documentation saying that they are allowed to be there. Because the O'Neill family owns that ranch house when the Marines come up to take over, okay? So they were very worried. So Jane came up with a plan. She said to herself, I'm going to have an audience with President Roosevelt when he comes on base. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to tell him, hey, this is how it is. He's going to, he's going to believe me. Well, sure enough, President Roosevelt came to the base for the dedication when it became Camp Pendleton. And unfortunately, Jane was not feeling well that day. And we're not sure how this came about. We're not sure if he went to her or if someone explained it to him. But he said, hey, she's fine. I'm not going to mess with that house at all. We've got to take care of what's here. We're going to take care of her. So what he decreed was that the last living relative, when they pass away, then the house will revert back to the Marine Corps. But until then, you can stay in that house until that happened. So, good old Jane Magee actually outlived President Roosevelt. She passed away in 1945, she passed away. Yep. No. Here's 55. This is 1955 here. This is the last living Magee here at the house. The gentleman on the left is Lewis. He was the youngest that was in that one picture I pointed out real quick. This is his wife across from him. And they're sitting in the living room there at Las Flores. We still have that clock that sits on the mantle, and we still have the photos and whatnot as well. And they always kept a photo up there in the corner of Richard O'Neill because he changed their lives. He gave them something that they all needed, a place to be together. So it didn't matter what era it was, they still loved it. So after this, she did pass away. This lady here passed away in 1967. And that's when the house came back to the Marine Corps. So, and we'll admit, they really didn't take care of the house of the Adobe too well. Then they just kind of lived in it. So it started to deteriorate. So when the Marine Corps came on, it had already started to deteriorate on the outside. And it was also starting to deteriorate on the inside as well. Because we all know what Adobe does. It goes back to the way it wants to be, right? So luckily for us, though, the Marine Corps, in conjunction with the United States National Park Service and also the University of Vermont graduates, they came out and made the house structurally sound. So they put rebar in the walls to kind of help keep it up a little bit more. They put a new roof on it. That place has been taken apart and put back together like you can't believe. So now these beautiful verandas have come back. Now you can just see the actual grandeur of it. there's not a lot of two-story adobe houses really anywhere that are still standing. So this is how it looks today. You can walk up on that beautiful veranda and see out and look at the Pacific Ocean right there. And what was great about this house as well back in those days was it was right there by the Sealy stagecoach line as well. So they had the stagecoach folks that would stop by. It was also a telegraph office was put in there too. It was also a polling place. So the Magee family was well known for many different reasons as well. During that whole thing that was going on, the renovation too, our historic society, Camp Pendleton, donated, I think it was about $28,000 to get it back and get it going again, which we've been able to do. So today, we like to say that this is how it looks today. You can see it sitting out there just as proud as can be. And if you guys get to go see it, you'll see how there was an outside walkway where the wood slats are that was covered up later on. That's why that wood is added to the outside of the adobe. And the long portion that's along here is a mixture of adobe and wood as well. So you'll be able to hopefully walk around and see it as it is now. All right, so that really does conclude my presentation on how the Magee family got to Las Flores and a little bit about Las Flores. Does anyone have any questions at all about that? Yes, sir.
When were property taxes first enacted, and how did that affect the ranchos?
So the ranches on Camp Pendleton, I'm trying to think, because I know for a fact foresters paid property taxes because that whole land belonged to the missions, right? Because I know we have evidence of that. So I would say in that area it was enacted, I would say 1870s it started coming on, because Mexico started to get some money as well. When we started having governors of California, they're like, we need to get some money because we've given all our land away. Now what do? You know, kind of a thing. So yes, because I know that there weren't any closets in the ranch house because you were taxed per room. So they didn't want to have closets. And that's why we have armoires and wardrobes that you'll see. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense. So, that's it. Yes, ma'am.
The name Wolfskill, Ruth Wolfskill Magee caught my attention.
Yes.
She related to, is it William Wolfskill that had the big ranch up in
Yep.
Orange County?
Yep, she was asking about Wolfskill.
Yeah.
She married a Magee.
Yeah, so
Yep.
she's related to that ranch family.
She is related. And also, if you've ever been in Carlsbad, there's a Magee house, a Magee park that sits right there. The second oldest son, Hugh, married the daughter, the Shipley family's daughter there. And that's why it's called the Magee house. And they moved up to Condor's Nest for quite some time as well. So yeah, the Magee family, they 8 kids. You know, someone's going to get married, right, and have kids too. So, yes, sir. You know, are you coming on the tour on the 18th? I'll tell you later then. That's what. Just remember this, it was during war. So the government has a way of acquiring land during war. Right? Eminent domain, or either, you know, they pass these wonderful these acts, right? And so that has a lot to do with how they got that land. So, any other questions? Yes, ma'am. No cemeteries. We have quite a few Indian burials, but we do not know where they are. And we will never be told where they are either. But there is no cemetery there. Most of the family members from the ranch house and all of them have ties in Los Angeles. So many of them are buried in Los Angeles because that's where they went home to. They owned blocks of houses in Los Angeles.
That was my question about where some of these people are buried and interred at.
Mm-hmm. Most of them are Los Angeles. Yeah, and we know, like with Pio Pico and all of them, unfortunately, he died. When he died, he had no money. Like, he didn't even have enough money. They didn't to bury him. So he went and was interned in a friend's tomb with a friend. because they had nothing to bury him with, which is so sad when you think about it. Little scoundrel, little fox he was. Yes, there's a lot of, there's a lot named after him, so he got that at least too. So if that's it, I want to say thank you for having me once again.